All right, good morning, everyone. This is Caitlin Coleman with Water Education Colorado. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar looking at alternative transfer methods, or ATMs. The program complements the content in our latest issue of Headwaters magazine, which is focused on ATMs and water banking. Find the magazine and learn more about us at yourwatercolorado.org. I have just a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. The webinar will last for about 1 hour. As attendees, you'll be muted throughout the presentation. If you have questions, please type them into the questions pane in your GoToWebinar toolbar, which should be on the side of your screen. We'll reserve about 15 minutes at the end of the webinar to address questions, which I'll read aloud so our speakers can respond. I'll also check those periodically throughout the webinar if anyone's having other issues. The webinar is being recorded, so I'll email it to you early next week, or possibly tomorrow. If you have any technical questions, please email my colleague Jenny at jennie@yourwatercolorado.org. Now let's launch into our topic. Coloradans are looking to make the most of our limited supply of available water by sharing it among multiple users through flexible sharing agreements, also known as alternative transfer methods, or ATMs. As our freelance journalist Alan Best wrote in his feature story for Headwaters, can we grow towns and cities and also corn and hay? And his answer was yes, arguably we can. Our state is looking to grow cities and farms side by sharing water through ATMs. Through Colorado's water plan, the state calls for 50,000 acre-feet of water identified in ATMs by 2030. Right now, 17,400 acre-feet is available through ATMs, which raises the question, how can we make ATMs more feasible or appealing, and how can we meet that goal? So we're joined today by 3 wonderful panelists: Jim Yahn with the North Sterling Irrigation District, Peter Nichols, Special Counsel to the Lower Arkansas Valley Water Conservancy District, and Kevin Rein, our state engineer. We'll approach this as a discussion moderated by Kevin, but before that discussion gets started, I'd like each of our speakers to introduce themselves and tell us about their nexus with the ATMs conversation. We'll begin our introductions with Jim and then end with Kevin so he can get the discussion going. So let's see if we can change slides.
And Caitlin, this is Kevin. I'm trying to advance it. I'm not sure whether I have control yet.
Let me try to give you control, and then as soon as we see your faces, we'll have Jim get started.
Well, you don't need to see my face for me to get started, so I'll go ahead and get the ball rolling. So good morning, everyone out there. I'm glad to be part of this webinar today. My name is Jim Yahn, as Caitlin mentioned, and I'm the manager of the North Sterling Irrigation District, and I've been in that position for 26 years. So the reason that I am part of this webinar is we have done 2 ATMs. We kind of did the first one before ATM was a cool thing to do. So back in 2005, we did an agreement with Xcel Energy, and I'll just briefly, rather than mention anything else about the irrigation district, I'll just briefly go into the 2 agreements that we have and just some highlights. That way, if you have any questions later, you can ask me about those, and you can relay those, the context of those agreements along with the slideshow. So anyway, we have 2 agreements. One with Xcel Energy, as I said, back in 2005, and we did a conventional change case. We changed 15,000 acre-feet of our water right. We have a reservoir that holds 74,590 acre-feet. So we changed part of our storage right. We also have a direct flow right, which we didn't change. Our storage, what Xcel needed was 3,000 acre-feet in the wintertime. They already had an agreement with Fort Morgan Reservoir and Irrigation Company for their summertime water, but early on in the 2000s, they needed additional water for wintertime supply. So we were the next downstream user to them. It's a Pawnee Power Plant in Brush, And so they came to us and we did a deal with them. The deal is 3,000 acre-feet of fully consumable water, and we had to guarantee it. Delivery from November to March, so just wintertime, equally distributed during those months. We had a two-tiered pricing, so we're more like an insurance policy to them. So we have a base payment, and originally that was $50 per acre-foot. They paid that whether they took any water or not. And then we had a delivery payment for whatever we delivered to them was $425 per acre-foot, in addition to the $50. It's a 25-year term starting in 2005. To facilitate this, we formed a separate water company. It's called the Point of Rocks Water Company, and that's so that it could be voluntary. Any of our landowners could be part of that water company. And we had 84.1% participation. So we're an irrigation district. We had 34,403.16 acres of our 40,916.94 acres that signed up to be part of the group. Just recently, we did a deal with BNN Energy, and that's for 6,800 acre-feet. And the difference is that this is a year-round lease. I can't divulge any pricing as part of our agreement, but it was more. So, but we do have a minimum there. It's a 10-year deal. The first 5 years, they have to use at least 6,000 acre-feet over the first 5 years, so total. And then the second 5 years, they have to use at least 4,000 acre-feet. So much less than their full request could be at 6,800 acre-feet. But we desired a minimum, but we wanted to give them flexibility as well. They have to make a couple of requests, one in December and then one in March. And we had 98.8% participation. The only interesting thing that we did here is we had a growing season request because our farmers needed to know how much they were going to take during the April through October months, and they are required to pay for that whether they use it or not. So that's our two deals, and that's kind of hopefully set the stage for what we're going to talk about today. So thank you.
Thanks, Jim. So next up, we'll hear from Peter.
Good morning. I'm Peter Nichols. I'm a water attorney and conservation attorney with Berg Hill, Greenleaf, and Rashidi in Boulder, Colorado. First got interested in sharing irrigation ag water with municipal and other uses during the drought of California experienced in the early 1990s when Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, which supplies the agencies from Los Angeles down to San Diego, leased water from the Central Valley and also from the Palo Verde Irrigation District. Some of you may know that turned into a 30-year deal in about 2004 between Met and the Palo Verde Irrigation District. I'm special counsel for the Lower Arkansas Valley Water Conservancy District, as Caitlin mentioned, and also for the Lower Arkansas Valley Super Ditch Company Incorporated, which was formed by the farmers in 2007 after a visit to Palo Verde Irrigation District to look at the lease arrangements that they had with Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. Worked with Representative Fisher, Jay Winter of the Lower Arkansas Valley Water Conservancy District to develop House Bill 131248 and then Senate Bill 15198 to set up pilot projects administered by the Colorado Water Conservation Board, and then worked with Kevin Rein on the development of the criteria and guidelines developed by the CWCB to implement that particular program. The major project that we're working on right now is the Catlin Pilot Project, which is a project of the Lower Ark District and the Super Ditch Company that provides about 500 acre-feet a year at about $500 per acre-foot to 3 municipalities, Fountain and Security up on Fountain Creek and Fowler upstream on the main stem of the Arkansas River. Involves 6 farms on the Catlin Canal. Catlin Canal is near Rocky Ford on the Lower Arkansas Valley. Before that, I was involved in an augmentation plan in about 2002, 2003 after the well crisis on the South Platte, and we put together a rotational fallowing program in support of Fort Lupton and Thermo Power before we knew that it was called rotational fallowing or ATMs, but that is still in operation so far as I know. Thanks. I'll turn it over to Kevin now.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Caitlin. My name is Kevin Rein. I'm the state engineer, and I've worked for the Division of Water Resources since 1998. And our involvement in the ATM discussion, probably twofold. First, if you look at the governor's direction on ag and the interest this administration has in preventing the permanent dry up of ag, we are a part of that conversation. Certainly we're not the policy direction that we don't set that at the Division of Water Resources, but we like to think we can facilitate good discussion on it, facilitate the direction that legislation might take, and help that along just with our administrative expertise. Second, and importantly, when we think about ATMs, we think about certain allowances, certain things that can be done under the provisions of the law that make these efforts more streamlined, make them more palatable or usable to certain water users. And part of that means there are often restrictions. And part of that combination of allowances and restrictions may involve our administrative authority to approve certain activities, to be part of the consultation process with another entity like CWCB. So we have had a fair amount of involvement and interest in the ATM discussion. And with that, Caitlin, I just appreciate having the chance to lead us through this discussion. And I think I'll launch into the meat of what we wanted to talk about. When I worked with the other panelists, Peter and Jim, we think the best way to come at this is to talk about some of the factors that can influence the use of an ATM. And to do that, we broke it down into, when we look at the different types of ATMs that are out there, I mentioned restrictions and allowances just a few minutes ago. And some of those restrictions, for lack of a better term, can be broken down into these 5 areas. One is the portion of a water right that can be transferred through an ATM. And when we talk about transferred, we're generally almost always talking about that irrigation water right and that transfer of that water right to either a municipal use or another ag use or other uses. And we'll see more about that in a minute. So the portion of the water right that can be transferred, and then for what duration and what frequency that water right can be transferred, that'll make more sense in a few minutes as well. What uses are allowed by water right transfer, because it doesn't necessarily allow for a transfer to just any beneficial use. The fourth one is very important, the application and approval process for a water right transfer. And this is important to consider because right now, when Jim talks about the water right transfer that they've done, that's been a traditional water court process. But this is somewhat of an allowance in my discussion about restrictions and allowances. Some of these allow for the transfer to happen outside of the water court process. And finally, what is the process to quantify the transferable amount? Because again, traditionally, that would be done through the water courts through a very deliberative process, and there are allowances there. Having set that background, what we're going to do is use 4 types of ATMs to elaborate on those 5 points I just made and maybe contrast them just a little bit. So I've put 4 types of ATMs in front of you, and I need to say quickly that we are not limited to just 4 ways of transferring irrigation consumptive use to another use. And if you look at a footnote, there are other ways to accomplish this transfer objective. We have substitute water supply plans. Peter just mentioned rotational crop management. Jim in his introduction talked about the water court process that they use, and water banking. The reason we've highlighted just these 4 that you see above is because they stand apart a little bit in that there was deliberate legislation that was vetted well among the water users, and each of those does give a fairly clear process for making that transfer. Those 4 are agricultural and in-stream flow loans. And while these titles we've given them can sound a little ambiguous, I've given the statutory reference as well, just so you clearly know which one we're talking about. So we have the ag and in-stream flow loans. We have interruptible water supply agreements, following leasing pilot projects that Peter alluded to just a minute ago. And then the recent one, agricultural water protection water right. And that's something, incidentally, that the Division of Water Resources is in the middle of rulemaking. We filed rules with the Water Court to facilitate the implementation of that particular type of ATM. What we'll do now is step through those 5 points I just made, and I will just briefly contrast the 4 different types, and then I'll ask Peter and Jim to maybe cite some of their experiences as they're relevant to this particular item. And the first one is going to be, again, that portion that's allowed to be transferred. And we're talking about how much of the water right may be represented by how much of the land, or how many shares, what percentage of the shares, that type of thing can be transferred. And the first one, when we talk about ag and in-stream flow loans, and I just want to go back just to give you a reference on this. This is something that was used by the Colorado Water Trust and the CWCB back in 2012, I believe. The Water Trust solicited participation from agricultural interests on the West Slope, and it was very successful. But this is just that temporary loan of a water right to the CWCB from the irrigator to meet an in-stream flow right. There also is a provision to allow it to be loaned to an ag interest. But back to the point of this slide, it's the entire amount of the water right that's considered that can actually be loaned. Now, next we have interruptible water supply agreements. In that case, also the entire water right can be used. The House Bill 1248 following leasing pilot projects, a little more restrictive. For certain land, only 3 years in 10 can be dried up. For a single farm, no more than 30% of that farm over 10 consecutive years. And then also there's a volumetric amount that it has to be between 100 and 1,000 acre-feet per year. Now, under certain conditions, that could be increased up to 10,000 acre-feet with the board giving approval. Finally, the Ag Water Protection Water Right, ATM, allows 50% of that changed water right, that part of the water right that's changed to an Ag Water Protection Water Right, to be used in any 1 year. And having said a fair amount thus far, I want to pause and let Peter or Jim jump in and just express maybe some of their experiences on this. And I'm also noting that we have a couple of these components coming up that probably will have more to weigh in on. Peter or Jim?
I can talk a little bit about the Catlin pilot project. There are 6 farms involved, about 1,000 acres, and we provide about 500 acre-feet a year by exchange to the town of Fowler on the main stem and to Fountain and Security Water District up on Fountain Creek. The farmers that are involved in this project rotate the land that they have involved, and they have found that during the years when they are fallowing, that's a good time to install irrigation improvements, line ditches, and level their fields. So they found it to be a useful thing. The one feedback that we've gotten from them recently is they wish they had enrolled more of their land so they would have more flexibility to move around the land that they fallowed over the 10-year period of the pilot project.
And all I'll say is, first, I want to make it clear that, you know, all of these things we call water sharing, do dry up ag land. So the thing that we like about ATMs is that the farmers maintain control. And so, but there is a dry up of farm ground whenever you do these transfer. So the nice thing about, we changed our water right in 2005, and we're a water short system. We have 40 like I said, about 41,000 acres in our district. We irrigate about 35,000 of them. It varies from 33 to 37, depending on how much water we have every year. And when we went in for the change case, we were not required to show any dry up because I allot so much water to our farmers, and they get to decide what land they're going to dry up. And it may be, which our farmers do a lot, they have part of their land in row crop, like corn or beans or sugar beets. And then they have part of their land, almost all of them probably split it about 50-50 in alfalfa. And with alfalfa, you can irrigate it the first cutting, and if you don't have enough water, you can not irrigate it the second or the third, or however you want to treat that water, but you hold it for your row crop so that you finish that crop. But alfalfa will recover the next year because it's a perennial crop. So that's kind of a nuance in our system that worked out really, very well with ATMs. And the reason, we're not really big on using some of the legislative actions just because they're more of a temporary nature. And if we're going to do it, we wanted to do it more on a permanent nature, where once this agreement is done, if we want to renew that agreement or whatever we could, it's on our terms. So the only one that we may have used, if it was in place, was the ag water protection, because we were limited, as you know. You can't change all your water without having some end user in place. So it's considered speculation if you try to change all your water. But we would have maybe used this where we could have changed up to 50% of our water and had that waiting for some entity in the future. So that's kind of my take on these.
Jim, I'd like to just touch base with you on a couple things. One, while we have on our slide regarding the portion allowed, we talk about the amount of land or the volume of water, and it seems like in your situation there's maybe a third or a subcomponent of that where it's what part of the season too. You've got some flexibility for a partial season.
Right. The first one that we did with Xcel Energy, we really liked that because it was wintertime, so November through March. And we knew going into the season how much water they had taken. So our farmers can adjust accordingly. Maybe they won't plant the acres that they want to, or that all their acres. And so we know upfront how much water they were going to use. The other thing is, as part of that, if we have a really good spring runoff, we could still fill our reservoir under free conditions. So even though they may have taken some in the winter, maybe our farmers really wouldn't see any of that, the results of them taking any water, if there's free river conditions. That doesn't happen all the time, because they could see it in a dry year. Definitely would see it. The other one is with BN Energy, they can take it any time during the course of the year, but we specifically called them out during the irrigation season because our farmers need to know how to plan, how much seed to buy, how much fertilizer, all that kind of thing up front. So we made them on March 1st tell us, okay, how much are you going to use during this? They can still request them, and we can say no, or we can say yes. But yeah, it gives us some flexibility, and we wanted to work that into our agreements just so that our farmers felt comfortable doing this.
One other quick point of emphasis that I'd like to make, Jim, you talked about the ag water protection water rights, and for the webinar participants, this is an interesting one. I know it's fairly new, and when Jim talked about the questions on speculation, what that particular ATM does is it allows a water user to change the water right that is quantified the historical consumptive use in court without having a non-speculative beneficial use. And that's by virtue of changing it to this ag water protection water right. What that does is help the farmer through this catch-22 that they would find themselves in if they were trying to lease or loan the water to a municipality. They would have to do the change first, and we all know that can take months and years. And so by then, the municipality may not need it. The flip side of that is if they go to court to try to change the water right without a beneficial use, they're subject to a speculation question. So this ag water protection water right specifically just gets them beyond that issue and helps them through it. I'll move on to the second point, the duration of the transfer. And again, quickly touch on the ag and in-stream flow loans, 180 or 120 days per year. And once you get the approval of that transfer, you can operate it no more than 3 years in a 10-year period. If you don't operate it, you can get a second approval for a second 10-year period. Interruptible water supply agreements, pretty much the same thing, 3 years in a single 10-year period, and an option to get a second and third 10-year period if you don't exercise it during the first one. For the fallowing leasing pilot projects, again, potentially all years in a single 10-year period. And as you saw in the previous slide, the limitation is really on percent of land fallowed. And then finally, the ag water protection water right, quite a bit more flexibility there in this regard. 3 years, and let me say this differently, once you get the substitute water supply plan approved to actually affect the use of that, then there's no limit in the number of years you can operate, but every third year you would have to come back to get a new substitute water supply plan approved. And to kick it back, I'll ask Peter really quick about pilot projects and what he sees the future for the Catlin pilot project that's been approved, given that it is just for a single 10-year period.
Thanks, Kevin. You know, what I've seen so far and what I expect to see for the remainder of the 10-year period is the farmers who are participating drying up or fallowing different acreage each year, although sometimes 2 or 3 years in a row, the same acreage, but moving it around rather than, say, drying up, say, 30% of their least productive land for a 10-year period. I think they like the flexibility of doing that, and particularly those that grow alfalfa. It gives them a chance to sort of schedule in the replanting of alfalfa that's required every so often to ensure high yields.
And Jim, again, looking at your water court decrees that allow this, how can you contrast what you've done through water court with this? What is your outlook for long-term exercise of the transfer?
Well, I think it looks good. I mean, because we went through water court, we have all of our accounting for our losses in our ditch, our harms, all quantified. So for instance, when we did the Xcel deal, we went through all of those, and we changed 15,000 acre-feet at the river. And but Xcel, you know, has the potential of not, actually they haven't used any of the water yet. So it's been 12 years, they haven't used any water, but they pay us the base payment. So it's, like I said, it's like an insurance policy. But we still have that water that's been changed for other uses. So when we were approached by another entity, we didn't know if we had enough water, but I was able to look through our accounting, all of the requirements in our decree, and come up with how much water do we have available for another entity. And so what happened was, when they came to us, they wanted 6,800 acre-feet. Well, if Xcel takes all the water they would like, 3,000 acre-feet, we wouldn't have enough because we have to maintain historic return flows, and that is done through the release of reservoir water or some recharge that we've done. So we wouldn't be able to satisfy that 6,800 acre-feet. So we made them request in December, and then if Xcel doesn't use any water, then they can make an additional request in March. And so it gives us some flexibility in there through our water court, but it also gives us a known quantity, and we can decide, you know, how we want to manage that. And the other thing is, at the same time, we were getting an augmentation plan for our wells, and we did some recharge. So we can make up a lot of those return flows through recharge, and just depending on the year, how much recharge we might get, that, you know, we don't have to release any water from the reservoir to make up those return flows And so I guess in the end, it looks long term. I mean, it looks good for us. And, you know, sometimes we wish we maybe would have changed a little bit more water so we could look at some of these things a little more in depth with other entities. But right now we've been able to satisfy those that have come to us. So I'd say in the future, it looks good for us.
Jim, is there a date or a period of time in the future after which you would no longer be able to exercise this allowance in your decree?
Not in our decree. There was no date that's spelled out in our decree. It was a permanent change.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I'll jump ahead to the next one, and this is a fairly straightforward discussion, but what are the allowed uses from the change? And going back to the initial one, the transfer, the loan to ag uses or to in-stream flows, it is fairly specific. It can be loaned to another ag irrigation water right on the same stream system, or decreed in-stream flow right that's held by the CWCB. So that's fairly restrictive. And as you'll see in a few minutes, this one has probably the more streamlined approach when it comes to approval. So maybe that goes hand in hand with the restrictions that are on it. And I think maybe our other panelists could say something about that in a minute too. For interruptible water supply agreements, it's allowed for any beneficial use. Again, the fallowing leasing pilot projects, when that legislation was first passed with House Bill 1248 in 2013, it was limited to municipal use. And I think that at the time the conversation was really about, that's where the opportunities were seen for transfer to municipal uses. However, a couple years later, I believe Peter and some of your folks came back and passed legislation to expand that to allow, in addition to municipal use, agricultural, environmental, industrial, and recreational use. And let me just add to that, again, Peter, you may elaborate, but it wasn't just the parties that were part of that transfer, part of that pilot project. It was other potential parties that would potentially lease the water from the Catlin. And finally, the ag water protection water right, that is just for any beneficial use. And I want to, one point that maybe we could address, Jim, it sounds like in your case, the beneficial use is fairly specific. And Peter, also, you may want to address part of why that changed for the pilot projects a couple years ago.
Sure.
Maybe Peter, you could start.
Okay. We, decided that we should expand or try to expand House Bill 13-1248 a couple years later to include these other uses, agriculture, environmental, industrial, and recreational, based on what we saw as potential lessees around the state of Colorado. Superditch is actually working on an environmental project and a recreational project down in the lower Arkansas Valley, and I'm working on an ag-to-ag project over in the San Luis Valley to help sort of address the new Rio Grande groundwater rules, which require replacement of well depletions. So the expanded uses, we think, will provide flexibility to facilitate testing out this concept in not only lower Arkansas Valley, but other parts of the state to meet these unmet needs without permanent dry up or change cases going through water court.
Thanks, Peter. And Jim, are you able to touch on that question? Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say for our change, it wasn't as specific as it looks, because it was, part was for Xcel Energy, but we also had some shorter term agreements with municipalities down in our area, and also negotiated for irrigation still. So we also had some smaller agreements with feedlots, so we have commercial included. So we changed a pretty broad change of, irrigation, stock watering, domestic, commercial, industrial, and municipal, all part of our change case.
Thanks for that. And I think, again, making a point from earlier, and I think you mentioned it, in order to do that in water court, you did have to have contracts or some showing that you actually had a non-speculative need, or that there were non-speculative needs out there for that.
That's correct.
Thanks. And that probably is a good lead into the next slide, the fourth of the components we talked about, and that's the application and approval process. And again, I think this helps us maybe look more closely at that consideration of allowances and restrictions kind of going hand in hand. And the first one, I mentioned this a minute ago, that the ag and in-stream flow loans, even though there's a fair amount of text there, probably has the more straightforward approval process, because this just involves, for an application at any rate, to file a request with the division engineer and give notice to the substitute water supply plan notification list. There's a comment period, certainly. Finally, a state engineer determination of no injury, and ultimately approval by the state and division engineer. And see, there's a little typo there. I apologize for that. But then there is an opportunity for an appeal to the water court. So again, that seems like many steps that we've outlined there. But again, this is all happening within the realm of the administrative agent, the division and state engineer, even though there is a public comment process. Interruptible water supply agreements, somewhat the same, an application to the state engineer with notice to the SWSP notification list, comment period, approval by the state engineer. Pilot projects, very interesting, because this is something that is ultimately under the purview of the Colorado Water Conservation Board. And the steps in this require first the submittal of a project concept to the CWCB just to be selected to be a pilot project. So think of that step as really getting the green light to even do it before the participant spends too much time on engineering. So there needs to be a concept approved by the CWCB, and then the applicant would submit the actual application to the CWCB for approval. That's where you would have all the engineering work done. And then for the CWCB to consider it, there needs to be a written determination by the state engineer that there's no injury, and then ultimately approval by the CWCB. And that written determination is a lot of where the basis for approval takes place. It's somewhat of, looks very much like a substitute water supply plan approval. Finally, the ag water protection water rights, that is something that happens first of all in water court. It's basically a very traditional quantification and change with very detailed terms and conditions to ensure no injury, and then a final decree from the water court. But to actually effectuate the transfer of that consumptive use water, the applicant would submit a substitute water supply plan application. Of course, that has notice as well. And then that approval to use the water for the new use comes through the SWSP approval by the state engineer. And again, that approval would allow the initial year and 2 successive years of operation. And so again, if I could, Peter and Jim, and Peter, you're sort of a good go-to person to look at the pilot project side and maybe elaborate a little bit on how this approval went for you on the initial pilot project.
Thanks, Kevin. Three observations. One is I think that the Ag and In-Stream Flow Loans Program has a simpler, shorter approval process because it's a very limited duration. And so they're talking about basically one season. And so there's not as much concern, I think, about other water rights owners about the potential for injury once the state engineer makes his determination. In the pilot projects, we worked with Representative Fisher and the legislature developed House Bill 1248 after we tried to do the same project through a substitute water supply plan. And the day after the state engineer approved the substitute water supply plan to loan water, ag water from the Catlin Canal to Fountain and Security, the state engineer and the Lower Arkansas Valley Water Conservancy District and the Super Ditch got sued. And before we could even finish briefing, we were out of water, and so there was no possibility of delivering water that year to the municipalities. So we looked at some of the problems that people raised in that particular issue and went back and sort of constructed House Bill 1248 to provide a lot of information and a lot of input on the front end, and a two-step process to sort of first alert everybody that we were thinking about this, and then the CWCB to say, okay, this is worthwhile, and then a very rigorous application process that includes a meeting of all of the parties who have to thrash out a report to the CWCB and to the state engineer on terms and conditions necessary to operate the project without injury to other water rights or interfering with the state's compact commitments. And then the state engineer makes his determination, and then there's an approval by the CWCB, and then if people are unhappy, they still can go to water court. There has not been any interruptible water supply agreement that I'm aware of. I think there were 2 applications, Kevin, you can probably clarify this, but they were withdrawn. And I'm not sure if that had to do with the fact that people looked at what happened to us when we filed the substitute water supply plan for the Catlin Fountain security leases and decided that it was just not worth the risk and the cost of trying to go forward in that manner and went down a different path. But one of the things that I think is important is to have this large amount of front-end information made available to not only people who are downstream or upstream, but other people, particularly in the ag community, to ensure them that they're not going to see any injury as a result of any expansion of use, any reduction in return flows. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. And maybe that's a good time to move on to the next slide. There's a fair amount to discuss, I believe, on that. And this is the 5th component we talked about, quantifying the transferable amount. That is such an important question in any change case. And I think we can have some good discussion on this. I do want to highlight that there is an interesting point for the ag and in-stream flow loans that, and we had, as I said, a fair amount of success with these in 2012 as far as working with the Water Trust to approve these. But the statute is intentional when it says a reasonable estimate of the historic consumptive use. And that's something for the state and division engineer to do a determination. We inferred from that, to a certain extent, that term reasonable estimate gave a little bit of latitude for maybe a more coarse, and I would say at the same time conservative, but a maybe more coarse analysis, not as detailed as a traditional water court historic consumptive use analysis. And I think that we were able to work through those without any risk of injury. For interruptible water supply agreements, detailed written report, I would call this a somewhat traditional in terms of detail HCU analysis that the state engineer would make a determination on, again, based on comments. Pilot projects, I'm going to say a little bit about this, and then Peter will want to elaborate on it. But that by statutory direction includes a streamlined approach to doing an HCU analysis, historic consumptive use analysis. Specifically, the statute directed that the criterion guidelines would, among other things, pilot the use of a streamlined approach. Pilot, that is, try it, see how it works, inform us for development on the concept. And so the criterion guidelines for pilot projects specifically gives factors, methodologies, et cetera, that can be used in a more straightforward, a significantly more straightforward and less time-consuming way, but that would be conservative so that there would not be concern about injury from other parties. ag water protection water rights, that's going to be pretty much a traditional quantification process in water court. And I'll stop there, and maybe both Jim and Peter can say something about, Jim, your water court process on quantification, and Peter, the pilot project approach.
Yeah, through the traditional method, and I think this is why we like it. I mean, some of the other things that you have to go to for these temporary ones is similar to what you do for it may be streamlined somewhat in the pilot projects, but it's similar to what you do for a traditional. And so we look at it as, you know, we would rather go through the traditional route because then it's permanent, and you allow both for opposition and for us as proponents, you allow people to come to the table and discuss, you know, whether you're injuring them or not. So it's a more finalized and a process that we think is the best as far as what we're doing anyway, just because of its permanency. The only thing I'd like to mention is that something interesting in our water court change case was that, because a lot of people think, well, if farmers would become more efficient, then there would be water to lease. Well, in our change case, which I think was appropriate, we have to track any increased sprinkler irrigation from the time of our change case. And that's so that we don't begin using this water more efficiently and lease those efficiencies to the detriment of people downstream. Because when you become more efficient, there's less return flows to the river for people downstream. So one of the things that we have to do is, if we ever deliver water for a changed purpose, we have to make up those historic return flows, the difference at the time that we made the change and how much we've increased our sprinkler irrigation. So those return flows are maintained in the system, because on the South Platte, you can do that as part of your water right. But if you do it for a change case, then you have to, or a changed water right, then we have to maintain those historic return flows.
Thanks, Jim. That's a really interesting point.
The streamlined approach came up during the legislative consideration of House Bill 1248. It really was an idea, I think, of Ivan Walters and Terry Skanga of the Upper Arkansas Water Conservancy District. And the success of this really, I think, you know, is attributable to Kevin and Kelly Thompson, the engineer's office, who convened with CWCB, a working group of about 18 engineers, to develop a spreadsheet-based model to calculate HCU and return flows in the Arkansas Basin. And it has turned out to be very transparent, and it was intentionally conservative. The engineers all agreed on a sort of consensus numbers for things like ditch leakage, on-farm efficiency, those kinds of things. And then the CWCB ultimately adopted the least fallowing tool for use in the program. It has worked very well because of the transparency on the front end and the input of a number of engineers that made suggestions as to how to make it better. For comparison, Kansas sued Colorado in 1968 and over the compact. And as a result of that, there was a settlement that used something called the HI model, which was a very conservative model that was developed to sort of figure out how much water Colorado was consuming and therefore how much Kansas was entitled to see across the state line. We've compared the results of the least fallowing tool to the HI model. The least fallowing tool at the time it was put together in 2013, 2014. I think most people thought it was 5%, maybe 10% conservative, comparing it to the HI model. In certain years, it may be 30 or 40% conservative. And in a sort of a worst case situation, it's at least 8% more conservative than the HI model, which itself is probably 5 or 10% conservative. But it does compute historic consumptive use and return flows very efficiently and very simply by farm unit. And then the state engineer has a chance to review that and determine the accuracy of it. But we've worked very closely with the state engineer's office in the division engineer's office and Division 2 and implementing it, and it's worked very well. One of the things we have discovered recently, however, is that particularly the ET factor that was applied to the least valuing tool works well in the Arkansas Valley, but it would not work well at a higher elevation, say the Rio Grande Valley. It would way underestimate the amount of HCU that the irrigator should be entitled to lease to someone else for another use. I'll turn it back to Kevin now.
Thanks, Peter. And I just want to make a quick comment, Caitlin, and then ask you to see if we have questions. This last slide, the quantification process, is such an interesting one because I know that John Stolp, who has been a leader in much of this discussion, and as he speaks to water users, that is a concern with ATMs since it often involves just a temporary lease. It seems that the quantification process can be so unwieldy in terms of just the legal and technical effort and cost to arrive at an answer on consumptive use that in itself can sort of stymie the process for many people. So this question of a streamlined approach is so interesting. And we also have had considerations outside of the pilot project of what are the ways that an ATM can take a more streamlined approach to an historic consumptive use analysis. So that conversation is going on out there. And with that, Caitlin, would you like to?
Can I add something, Kevin?
Whether we have questions? Yes, absolutely.
One of the reasons that the pilot project and the lease selling tool has been important, in my experience, is that after the Jones ditch case and the recent FRICO case, many ditch companies and irrigators are really nervous about going to water court and afraid that if they go to water court, they're going to walk out of water court with a lot less water than they walked in, based on historical use or even the original intent of the original appropriators. And so they're a lot more comfortable with this administrative approach, and I believe this is true of ag and stream flow loans, interruptible water supply agreements, House Bill 1248 pilot projects, and subject water supply plans. There is no precedent established by the state or the division engineer's determination of any of these factors regarding HCU or return flows. So if there is ultimately a desire to go make a more permanent change through water court, people have not given up any of their rights or any of their water rights, so to speak, before they walk in the front door of the court. And I think that's been critical, at least in the projects I've been involved in, because people are very nervous about going to water court and seeing what might happen, both because of the results, but also because of the costs, which we're talking about typically hundreds of thousands of dollars of legal and engineering fees for any significant changes of quantities of water that have been used historically for irrigation to another use in another location. Thanks for letting me add that.
Thanks, Peter.
All right, well, thank you all. Kevin, do you want to switch over to the questions slide if you guys have nothing more to add? And we'll turn to you guys to answer some questions. If you happen to join the presentation late and would like to pose a question, use the questions section of the GoToWebinar dashboard located on the side of your screen. And we've already gotten a few questions in. We don't have a lot of time. We got one before the webinar even started, so we'll start there. From John George, he asked, there's been a lot of talk about ATMs over the past 10 years, but only a few projects have been developed. In order of importance, what do you think the barriers are to ATMs standing on their own 2 feet?
And I'll start with that, Caitlin. John, I think that's the one question that, Caitlin, you said came in before we started. And I think a lot of that is answered in the discussion that we just had. Some of these water user may see, as Peter said, the risk of going in and quantifying their water right and maybe coming out with something less than they thought they should have or deserve. I think just the idea of spending a lot of time and effort for a short-term lease is also an issue. And by short-term, look at interruptible water supply agreements. Just 3 years out of 10, and then you're done. And it requires a fairly detailed historic consumptive use analysis. That's my quick thought on that.
This is Jim. I would say I have 4 things. So, we've done 2 of them. And so the main thing is infrastructure. You have to be able to get the water to where it's needed and where you can get the price that's acceptable to the farmers in order not to farm. Some people think that the farmers are going to, just lease it for enough to what they could make farming and then not have to farm. That's not the case. They would rather farm. Most all of our farmers like to farm, so they'd like to farm. So infrastructure and storage is a big part of the infrastructure. So on the only reason that we could work to deal with Xcel Energy is that we had a storage facility. The only reason we could work to deal with the BNN Energy is because we had a storage facility. They built some infrastructure, a pipeline to take the water where they needed it. So the infrastructure has to be in place. The Xcel Energy, it was just an exchange of water, so that was easy to do. But as I mentioned, the price is very important, and the length of term is very important. And lastly, it's just a trust. Our farmers did it because they were a big entity, and they allowed me to go out and the board to go out and talk with these entities, and they trusted us to do that, and that we had their best interest in mind. And so those 4 things, I think, it's not whether we go to water court or not. We went to water court. We paid for it without delivering any water because we had a base payment. We paid for that within the first 2 years. And it's because it's a longer term deal, we could do that. If you're just talking about temporary things here and there, that's, we're not really interested in doing that so much. If we're going to do it, we're in it for the long haul, and that's the way farmers think.
Thanks.
I've got a little bit different view of this. Certainly I agree with Jim. Price is important. You talk about leases with farmers, and that's the first question out of their mouth is how much do we get? $500 an acre foot in the lower Arkansas Valley on the Catlin project is working out to about $1,000 per acre to the farmers. When we tried to do this first in 2011, we basically had to go around and talk to farmers individually to get 5 or 6 of them interested because commodity prices were very good at the time. Those farmers that signed up for that 10-year pilot project now are looking pretty fat and happy compared to a lot of their neighbors. We wouldn't have to go out and solicit participation now at $500 per acre foot. In fact, we've had people come in the door and say, hey, we would like to participate in this. Infrastructure certainly is important. In the lower Arkansas Valley, we've been able to take advantage of existing infrastructure to be able to exchange and trade water to get it to where we need it. I think one of the major factors has been municipal reluctance for a couple of reasons. One is this is sort of new to them. It doesn't look permanent. They're worried that by the time the lease is expired, maybe their competitor municipality has purchased the water, and then they will dry it up and they will lose their future supply. The second thing is, I think that, we have had pretty good hydrological conditions for the last 10 years or so, and municipal reservoirs are full. They're not feeling super pressed, and they're still trying to deal with some of their infrastructure and their redundancy issues that they have and discovered after the 2002 drought.
All right, thanks everyone. So we have a ton of questions. I think I'm only going to ask one more, and then we'll see if you guys are all willing to email some responses. But the next one I'm going to ask is coming from Sean Chambers, and he asks, are there any unique legal provisions that apply or advice offered on the development of interruptible supply agreements or other ATM tools in the designated groundwater environment?
I think that's for Kevin.
Yeah, I think so too, Kevin.
I'm thinking that too, and it's not often that I'm too stumped, but I want to thank Sean in terms of applying this concept of changing the historical use from a well using designated groundwater. And then I think your question was fairly complex, certain legal considerations in that lease deal. I think that might be one, Caitlin, just so I don't waste too much time, that maybe we could answer by email. And I'm sorry to do that, unless Peter has something. Okay.
So I'll try one more if you guys have time for it. How about this one? How are the ag water protection water right use? Why are those only in use in divisions 1 and 2? Will it be extended to other divisions eventually?
I can give a quick answer on that because I was part of that conversation as that legislation was developing. And the concern was, I believe the West Slope entities, as they looked at this, their stated concern before the committees was that there would be a significant number of applications going before the water court to do these changes, to change the historical consumptive use to an ag water protection water right, and that would take significant participation by the parties on the West Slope at significant cost. And so they were happy to let this legislation go through if it were limited to the Front Range to divisions 1 and 2. And it's pretty much that straightforward.
All right, well, thank you all, unless anyone has anything more to add.
No, I just, Caitlin, I would offer that if anybody has any specific questions about our agreement, I'd be happy to talk with them about our 2 agreements, because we didn't get into the details of our agreements very in depth. So if anybody would like that, I'm more than happy to share what I know.
Thanks.
And I'd echo that.
You had a
I'd echo that,
so
Peter.
We'll email out a recording of the presentation. I'll follow up with all of our panelists with the remaining questions that we have not been able to answer. And then if you don't have the contact info for our panelists, I'll see if it's okay to share that with everyone. Again, thank you to our panelists. We encourage everyone listening to take the next step by checking out our Headwaters magazine and website for original reporting on ATMs and other upcoming opportunities. Thanks to everyone for your participation and questions, and you should see a few survey questions as the webinar ends to share your feedback, so take a few minutes to complete those. And that is all. This completes our webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.